Previously on Patrick H. Willems.
Charles, my best buddy.
I can't take any more of this, man. I'm leaving.
It's just me and my good friend, Charles. It's time to chill out and drink some wine while watching the entire filmography.
Right back down to that original verse. And then up to this little lead line here, right?
Do you know about this thing with the coconut?
Coconut. Oh, yeah, you mean Charles.
You know Charles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a call next week.
Cool.
So then throw in the ad 9.
So Charles, as you'll remember when we last left off, Coppola had bet everything on the first movie out of his new studio. He hoped it would revolutionize the film industry and create a viable competitor to the major Hollywood studios. It did not. The movie bombed and he lost it all. He was in debt, he was desperate, and so now we arrive at Coppola's 80s period, and paired with this, naturally, will be the director's cut Zinfandel. Now this is a Zinfandel that pushes the envelope of decadence with voluptuous concentrated flavors of fruit jam, chocolate, and vanilla, all in one wine. So Francis, we've been through a lot, so we're on a first-name basis now, is a filmmaker whose career has a clear before and after point. And that point is One from the Heart. While the failure of One from the Heart is genuinely a spectacular bummer, in a way, it freed Francis from the pressure of being all caps 5-time Academy Award winner Francis Ford Coppola. Yes, because of his debts, he had to work constantly for the next decade, but it also gave him a new sense of freedom to experiment with wildly different kinds of movies. He started the decade with 2 adaptations of novels by S.E. Hinton, The Outsiders and Rumblefish, shot back-to-back in Tulsa, Oklahoma with the same crew and much of the same cast. The Outsiders is a relatively straightforward coming-of-age story, but with some small stylistic flourishes, like when the film takes on the look of Gone with the Wind, as the characters Johnny and Ponyboy become obsessed with the book. Rumblefish is the companion piece. It's an experimental black and white film mostly influenced by the French New Wave. Its scene transitions use time-lapse photography that seems like a nod to Koyaanisqatsi, the experimental art film that Francis had recently produced. Rumblefish is like the Zooropa to The Outsiders' Achtung Baby. And for you younger viewers, this was a reference to the rock and roll band U2. And Rumblefish is, to date, the only Coppola movie in the Criterion Collection. That's right. He has just as many as Robert Zemeckis, which is half as many as Michael Bay. So people talk a lot about how J.J. Abrams is the best at casting and discovering new talent, and don't get me wrong, he's very good at it. It's probably the thing he's best at, but you know who's better? Francis Ford Coppola. So let's run through a list of actors that he cast in major roles before they became movie stars. We've got James Caan, Robert Duvall, Al Pacino, Diane Keaton and Lane, Talia Shire, Lawrence Fishburne, Patrick Swayze, Rob Lowe, Tom Cruise, Matt Dillon, Ralph Macchio, Emilio Estevez, Nicolas Cage, Jim Carrey, Matt Damon, and Alden Ehrenreich. So look, when people give Francis shit for casting his daughter Sophia in Godfather 3, consider his otherwise spotless track record of finding new young talent. This is like the one time it didn't work out. So after those movies, Paramount hired him to make The Cotton Club, which they hoped would be another Godfather. They even got Mario Puzo to co-write the script. What Francis made was less a crime epic and more of a celebration of the Harlem jazz scene in the 1930s. So one thing about The Cotton Club, while Francis still had final cut in his contract for all his movies, here he allowed himself to be pressured by producer Robert Evans into cutting down the storylines for the black characters. I feel like maybe what happened with One from the Heart shook his confidence a little bit, but years later he realized the mistake that he had made and restored those storylines in the director's cut called The Cotton Club Encore. This cut has much more Gregory Hines dancing and so obviously is way better than the theatrical cut. Then he followed this up with a time travel romantic comedy. Seriously, Francis's 80s run is wild. Now, Peggy Sue Got Married might seem like a total outlier in his filmography. How does this fit in with anything else? And sure, it might have been just a work-for-hire job, but I think there is a deeper connection there. And we're going to get to that later on, so let's just put a pin in that for now. One very important thing that I need to mention about Peggy Sue Got Married, we can see Francis's genius on display here, as he did what no other filmmaker in history has ever dared to do. He put Nicolas Cage and Jim Carrey in the same movie. Just a truly staggering next level move. They have multiple scenes together. They sing together. And with that, I believe I have now spent more time talking about Peggy Sue Got Married than Godfather Part 2. After this, he made Gardens of Stone, a Vietnam War drama that's kind of a companion piece to Apocalypse Now, and look, I know I'm trying to be comprehensive here, but sometimes I don't really have that much to say about a movie. I thought this one was kind of dull. It didn't really work for me. I'm sorry. But now, we arrive at Tucker, the Man and His Dream, the most important movie Coppola made in the 1980s. This film was based on the true story of Preston Tucker's attempt to produce the Tucker sedan in 1948. Originally, Francis planned to make this as a musical starring Marlon Brando in the late 70s, but over the next decade, it evolved a lot. So let me just tell you what this movie is about. It's about an ambitious man with a big family who has a dream to revolutionize an established American industry by doing things in a new, better way. And in the end, despite his best intentions, the system is too powerful and he has to shut down his operation. So, does this sound familiar at all? It's the same thing that happened to Coppola. This is absolutely not a coincidence. Francis even brought back Vittorio Storaro, the cinematographer for One from the Heart, to shoot Tucker. And he employed some of the theatrical stylistic moves that he had used there, like putting two people having a phone call in the same physical space and using a wall as a sort of split screen. But while Francis is reflecting on his greatest career failure, there's no sense of bitterness here. He presents the story like a Frank Capra film, full of hope and optimism. In the end, Tucker wins a moral victory. He might not be able to change the system, but he doesn't let it change him.
It doesn't matter if racing never changes. What matters is if we let racing change us.
Is Speed Racer the best movie ever made about fighting for artistic freedom within a capitalist system? I think it might be. Also, great triple feature is Speed Racer, Tucker the Man and His Dream, and Ford v Ferrari, 3 movies about cars that are really about Hollywood filmmaking. But what adds an extra layer to this story is that Tucker was a reunion for Francis and the producer of the movie, his good buddy George. Everyone talks about Lucas and Spielberg, Georgie and Stevie. the Beard Buddies. They're the guys who kicked off the blockbuster era. They're the guys who created Indiana Jones. And yes, that is a great, important partnership. But the partnership I really care about is Francis and George. They met when Lucas visited the set of Finian's Rainbow and quickly became friends and collaborators. Lucas was an assistant on The Rain People, Coppola produced THX and American Graffiti. They were co-founders of American Zoetrope. Lucas shared Coppola's desire for independence and creative freedom. His tastes were even less mainstream. He was more interested in experimenting with visuals and sound than in telling traditional stories.
I like cinema verite documentaries. I like non-story, non-character tone poems, and that's the filmmaking that I was interested in.
He only made American Graffiti because Coppola challenged him to write something that mainstream audiences would actually want to watch. Lucas's next project was supposed to be Apocalypse Now, which he was going to make as a low-budget movie shot on 16mm film. But then that got tied up at the studio, so Lucas went and made Star Wars instead. And everything changed. Star Wars, a movie some of you may have seen before, ended up being the highest grossing film of all time, and the merchandise rights made Lucas astoundingly wealthy. So then, right when Coppola was self-financing One from the Heart and gambling everything on one movie, Lucas did the exact same thing. Lucas produced The Empire Strikes Back with his own money, and look, that was obviously also a risk, but it was also a sequel to the biggest movie of all time, so it was a little bit safer than what Coppola was doing. And as we all know, The Empire Strikes Back was a hit. He finally earned true independence from the Hollywood studios, but it came at a cost. Since 1977, the only movies George Lucas has directed have been Star Wars movies. He gave up most of his artistic dreams. He handed Apocalypse Now to Coppola because now he had an empire to run and a franchise to manage.
I don't think everything should be this big blown out, super kind of movie that I stumbled into. Is definitely not what I meant to do. And I just sort of followed it to the end.
You called it a detour.
It is a detour. It's the 30-year detour.
When Lucas finished the Star Wars prequel trilogy, he talked about how he would switch to making smaller, personal, experimental movies.
You said to somebody, I'm going to go off and make these art films that nobody's going to want to watch.
Yeah, I've earned enough, I've worked enough to be able to fail the rest of my life, and that's what I'm going to do.
But unless he's been making those in secret, this still hasn't happened yet. Hi, George. If these secret movies really do exist, I would love to see them, so please just send a little link to this email address. Thanks very much. George Lucas hit pause on a promising filmmaking career and put all his other projects on hold. And he never got back to them. But all those things Lucas had planned to do, Coppola actually did. He made Apocalypse Now. He spent years making wildly different experimental films within the studio system. Decades before Lucas pioneered digital filmmaking technology, Coppola developed the pre-visualization process that's now standard on all blockbuster movies. And in the 21st century, Coppola did exactly what Lucas had promised to do. He self-financed small, personal, experimental art films. These two friends ended up as reflections of each other, each taking different paths that would occasionally intersect. Coppola bailed Lucas out with American Graffiti, then 15 years later, Lucas bailed Coppola out by producing Tucker. And together in the mid-80s, they made a $24 million 3D sci-fi Michael Jackson music video Disney theme park attraction called Captain EO because it was the 80s and shit like that happened back then. If you look at any interview with George Lucas from the last 20 years, he sounds sad. He's a billionaire who created one of the most beloved things ever, but he sounds like he has regrets. Coppola, though, doesn't seem to. Even if everything didn't quite work out the way he hoped, he's had a career that he seems proud of. And hey, there is still time for these guys to work together again. So if you want to see that happen, let's get hashtag Francis and George make a movie trending on Twitter. And then, one last time, they can be
reunited, and it feels so
love it. Alright, so 1 week ago, when I was a young, foolish man who thought I was going to be able to fit all of this into one video, I assumed I would have to make compromises and be selective about which of Francis's films I discussed. But now that it's 2 parts, I can do whatever I want. It's all going in. So let's talk about the weird shit. Captain EO was a Disney theme park attraction starring Michael Jackson that opened in 1986. And like everything in Michael Jackson's past, deserves to be investigated thoroughly. It wasn't a ride or a show, but instead pretty much a short film, which is kind of a weird thing to put in Disneyland, but it was the mid-80s and Michael Jackson could basically do whatever he wanted. The reason Captain EO happened is that Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, who were running Disney at the time, desperately wanted to produce anything that involved big-name stars. So to make this thing, they brought in Francis's best buddy, George Lucas. George knew that Francis was still in debt and would take any work he could get, so George brought him in to direct. They co-wrote it with a man named Rusty Lemirande, and if you rearrange a few letters in his name, it becomes Sturry Lemonade. Now this could have been an easy paycheck job. You show up, let MJ dance, have Disney Imagineering design and build everything, and then you're done. But Francis doesn't do that. The thing about Francis that is becoming clear from obsessively studying his films and reading interviews and talking to people who have worked with him is that he always goes so much harder than he really has to. Francis brought in allusions to Greek mythology, with the name Captain EO being a nod to the Greek god Eos. He brought on Vittorio Storaro to handle the lighting design and develop a system to shoot in 3D. And in classic Coppola style, it went way over budget and way over schedule. It was supposed to cost about $15 million and ended up costing about $23 million. That's right. This 17-minute short film cost almost as much as One from the Heart, a movie that bankrupted a studio. But considering all the years this played in Disney parks, it may actually be the most viewed thing Francis Ford Coppola has ever made. That's weird, and yet somehow, a 3D Disneyland Michael Jackson sci-fi thing is not the most unexpected Coppola project of the 80s. Not even close, because you know what's weirder? When he hosted/guest directed an episode of Saturday Night Live in 1986. It's a very weird episode where Francis is not technically the host, but the whole episode is built around this conceit that he's directing it, so he constantly shows up interrupting sketches to give notes, and the title sequence and monologue are in a new style to feel like it's a Coppola production. I guess during the mid-80s, Francis was just like the main character in everyone's favorite Jim Carrey movie. Yes Man, the movie where he says yes to everything. Because it gets even weirder. In 1987, Academy Award-winning director Francis Ford Coppola directed an episode of Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater. That's right, it is a retelling of The Legend of Rip Van Winkle starring Harry Dean Stanton and Talia Shire, Francis's sister. And once again, Francis went hard. He maintained the theatrical aesthetic the show usually had, but employed a much stronger color palette, bathing scenes in bold, saturated colors, kind of like Storaro would. In a lot of ways, this episode feels like a trial run for the visual style of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which he would make 5 years later. Francis brought in Aiko Ishioka as the artistic concept designer for this episode, and 5 years later, she would win an Oscar for her costume designs for Dracula. Right now, if you were staring at your screen, slack-jawed like a monster in a Stephen Sommers movie, asking, did he really spend more time on an episode of Fairy Tale Theater than Godfather Part 2? The answer is yes. See, I'm like Francis, a bad boy who plays by his own rules. But I need to take this video further. It's not good enough yet. It needs more. I've realized I had learned all I could from studying Francis's films. I needed to go further. The wine was helping me to get inside his head. I got a standing desk to be more like Walter Murch, but I needed to look into the man's eyes. I needed to meet him, face to face, through a computer screen on a Zoom call with 50 other people who also bought the $800 case of wine. I wasn't allowed to record it, but I discreetly got a few screenshots. And when I said, "Hi, Francis," and asked my question, I could see in his eyes that he respected me more than anyone else there. I could see in his eyes not only respect, but fear. Francis could see me as the powerful wolf that I was, a beast of the night.
Hey, I'm gonna go see Pat.
How's Pat doing, by the way? I haven't heard anything since Matt moved out.
Hey Pat, I hadn't heard from you in a while, and I just wanted to drop off this belated birthday gift.
Jacob, my good friend, thank you. What brings you here at this witching hour?
It's only 4 p.m. Are you okay?
I am wonderful. I feel like a creature in flight. The open sky laid bare before me, awaiting my next move with anticipation.
Oh, Pat, you can't drink wine with a mask on.
We'll find a way. Jacob, I appreciate you visiting, but you must excuse me. Take care, my good friend.
Wait, I didn't finish reading the subtitles.
Jake. Now that I have become such a fearsome beast, I need a wine to reflect the bloodlust I feel devouring these films. A full-bodied white wine. The director's cut Chardonnay. Now this is a full-bodied Chardonnay, bursting with flavors of butterscotch, brioche, and baked apples. During my talk with my new best friend, Francis, he shared with me a pearl of wisdom. He said that when he's making a movie, he boils the core theme down to a single word, and that word motivates every decision that he has to make when directing. So on The Conversation, that one-word theme was privacy, and that's what motivated all his decisions, like the one to put Harry Cole in a see-through raincoat for the whole film. So if I'm looking at Francis's entire career like one giant film, and I had to apply a single one-word theme to it all, that one-word theme would be leprechaun. I'm just kidding, I was being tricky there. Like a leprechaun, but actually I'm talking about family. The one-word theme is family. The idea of family runs through his entire filmography. When Roger Corman gave him a chance to write and direct his first movie, Francis chose to center it on a large multi-generational family. Family is the focus of The Outsiders and Rumblefish and The Cotton Club. Tucker, the Man in His Dream, is about a man much like Francis himself who has a large family that he involves in his work. And then there's The Godfather, the saga that has defined his career, which follows an Italian-American family over decades. Behind the scenes, Francis has found a makeshift family of collaborators that he's stuck with for decades. First with American Zoetrope, and then with people like Vittorio Storaro, our editor Barry Malkin, actors like Robert Duvall and Lawrence Fishburne and Diane Lane. For decades, anytime he shot a movie in his home of San Francisco, he made sure to cast local actor Al Nalbandian. Christopher Nolan keeps making movies about how much he wants to finish filming so he can get home to see his family. But Francis brings the whole family along and makes them a part of the movie. His filmmaking career is a family business. He cast his sister Talia in the Godfather films, then hired her husband David Shire to compose the music for The Conversation. His father Carmine was the composer for 7 of his movies. He cast his nephew Nicolas Cage in 3 movies. His son Roman supervised the visual effects for Dracula. Francis Ford Coppola is the Dom Toretto of Hollywood filmmakers. People like to throw out the word nepotism, mostly because of the time that he cast Sophia in Godfather 3, but I think this is reductive. His method of working is intertwined with the subjects of his work. People only cry nepotism in the rare occasion that it doesn't work out. When it does, no one seems to mind. Look, we would not have Nicolas Cage's career if his uncle Francis had not cast him. So are you really gonna complain about that? Really? The best example of the Coppola family approach is in Francis's segment of the anthology film New York Stories. He wrote it with Sophia, who also designed the costumes. Carmine composed the music and also acts in one scene. The story is about the family of a flute player, and Carmine himself is a flute player. And the rest of the crew is made up of the filmmaking family Coppola had built over the previous 2 decades. This segment, in my opinion, kind of sucks. But even if the film itself doesn't work, there's something endearing about the making of it, especially when you look at the opening credits where everyone is only credited by their first name. It's written by Francis and Sophia, music by Carmine. This doesn't feel like a selfish work of nepotism. This feels like a family production. It still does kind of suck though. In the early 90s, just over a decade after One from the Heart, Francis finally climbed out of his giant pit of financial debt. He gave in to demands and made a 3rd and final Godfather movie. And while it's obviously not in the same league as the first 2, I still think it's actually pretty good. And then, in a classic Francis move, he made a Dracula movie, but did it in a totally bonkers way that no one else would do. It looks completely unlike pretty much any horror movie that anyone had made in like 40 years. And it was a surprise blockbuster. And this time, despite all the craziness about the way he made it, like hiring his own son to supervise the complex in-camera special effects, he managed to deliver it on time and under budget. It took decades, but he finally did it. But look, I know why you're watching this video. It's for Jack. How do we explain Jack? This is the one that makes no sense. This is the one that no one is going to defend. It's not just bad, it's weird. Why is this heartwarming family comedy rated PG-13? Why does it contain so many references to sex? Like this scene where Jack's dad is photographing sexy models sitting on giant phallic carrots. Why does Fran Drescher make out with a 10-year-old boy? Who thought any of this was a good idea? Between Jack and Hook, it seems like there was this period in the 90s where major directors just really wanted to make movies about childhood with Robin Williams. Or maybe Robin Williams went to them and was like, Steve, Francis, I just gotta be in a movie where I eat gross food with kids in a treehouse. But even if Jack isn't good, I can see some threads between this and his other films. There's a strange sort of trilogy spanning 3 decades, with Peggy Sue Got Married, Jack, and Youth Without Youth, the first of the 3 small art movies he made in his 2000s period. All 3 are movies that grapple with the idea of aging. Peggy Sue Got Married is about an adult woman revisiting her past and questioning the choices she made. Jack is about a person who feels young but is in a rapidly aging body, who has to accept the limited amount of time that he has left in his life. And Youth Without Youth is about an old man who becomes young and gains a new lease on life. And when you consider these alongside something like Tucker, which is clearly a case of Francis reflecting on his recent past, you get a portrait of a man considering the choices he's made, then what it means to be entering the later part of one's life, and finally rediscovering his passion for his work. Or maybe he just thought it would be fun to make a movie where Robin Williams farts into a can. That's also possible. So now this is the part of the video where like 5 people are shouting, "Talk about the Rainmaker." I'm looking at you, Legal Eagle. So okay, here's the part about the Rainmaker. Something only 90s kids remember is that for several years, one of the hottest trends in Hollywood was legal dramas adapted from John Grisham books. We're talking The Firm, The Client, The Pelican Brief, A Time to Kill. These were like the superhero movies of their time. Audiences could not get enough of them. So Francis made one. It starred up-and-coming actor Matt Damon alongside Danny DeVito. It's called The Rainmaker, and it's pretty good. Not as good as The Firm, but good. It doesn't contain any of the usual Francis flourishes. It is a straight down the middle crowd pleaser. And it was the last Hollywood movie he ever made. So all right, you frothing at the mouth Grisham fanatics, you better be happy now, because we're moving on. So now finally, we arrive at our last wine. It's the director's cut Pinot Noir. Apparently this is an abundantly flavorful Pinot, displaying vibrant tones of red cherry and pomegranate. Does anyone actually care about this wine stuff? Is anyone watching this video and drinking the wines along with me as I talk about them? I don't think so. Look, I'm trying to be comprehensive here. I'm trying to include everything that came in this package. But look, I still haven't talked about the signed copy of the script for the conversation. That seems like kind of a big deal. I could spend 90 minutes now, like, reading the whole thing aloud, but no one wants that. What's become very clear over the course of these videos is that Francis Ford Coppola has had a long career. He's done a lot of stuff. He's made a lot of movies. He's made a lot of wine. And try as I might, I can't cover everything. I really tried though. So what I'll say is that the wine is tasty. The conversation has a good screenplay. And now we're gonna move on. Something I'm never sure about is to what extent I should read into films to try to interpret the director's interior life. It's one thing to look at The Godfather and say, this is a movie about succession and familial loyalty. But is it a step too far to say, this movie reveals Coppola's fear of losing his family to his work? And is it another step too far to draw a connection between the death of Coppola's son Giancarlo in 1986 and Michael Corleone's daughter dying at the end of The Godfather Part 3? I don't know. I can't tell you where the line is. With a filmmaker like Coppola, who puts so much of himself into his movies and involves his family in so much of his work, there are going to be connections between his life and his films. But there's also a point where I get uncomfortable trying to psychoanalyze this man who is now a friend that I greatly respect. Francis caused a real stir last year when he dared to say he didn't care for Marvel movies. People got real angry. At the time, I was like, who cares? Did anyone really expect him to be a big Ant-Man fan? But now, spending all this time immersed in his work, I get where he was coming from. He spent his whole life fighting against the established studio system, fighting for creative freedom and the opportunities to make his own films on his own terms, to make mainstream movies that were experimental and dared to challenge the audience. And to someone like that, I imagine the success of Marvel, with its somewhat homogenized factory-like production model which limits the amount of personal expression a director can have, is probably pretty upsetting. This is exactly what he fought against. So maybe cut the guy a break if he doesn't like the same superhero movies as you. After the 90s, Francis was done with Hollywood studio filmmaking and settled into the final act of his career. He was finally financially stable again, thanks largely to the winery and his luxury resorts. By the way, here's a pitch. Once we can travel safely again, how about I make the final chapter in my Coppola video trilogy, where I stay in one of Francis's Italian resorts And while I'm there, I finally watch You're a Big Boy Now. So if anyone wants to fund that, let me know. In the past 20 years, Francis has made a few movies. He followed George Lucas's lead and embraced digital filmmaking technology, but used it to make strange little experimental films. He's still working on projects which may or may not ever be released. Now, there's no one he has to answer to. He's truly independent. Francis has what he always wanted. When I ordered this giant case of wine, the website wasn't called francisfordcoppolawinery.com. It was called thefamilycoppola.com. This is and always has been a family business. Francis founded American Zoetrope with a found family of filmmaker friends, brought his real family into his work, and passed down the company to his children. Sofia Coppola is now the co-owner of American Zoetrope, along with her brother Roman. So I felt that the right way to end this was to finish off the last Francis Ford Coppola director's cut wine and crack open a chilled can of Sophia Rosé, which Francis made in honor of his daughter. In a couple weeks, Sophia's new film will be released, and it's about an adult woman's relationship with her father. A toast to Francis and the family Coppola. Salute. So what can I, burgeoning YouTube genius, say about the inimitable Francis Ford Coppola? I've learned so many lessons from him on this journey. The importance of fighting for creative freedom, of experimenting and evolving as an artist, why you need to create multiple revenue streams. It's all about that passive income, baby. Don't forget to purchase a Charl pin or striped shirt t-shirt in our merch store. I can do all of these things, but Francis has one advantage. One thing I don't. His family. He has their support, their love, their talent. They motivate him. He can pass on his legacy to them. And I am here, childless and alone. But without a family, I'll have to settle for the next best thing. Underlings. Matt's gone now, so I'll need to find someone else. No, we need to keep Jake at a distance. I think he's starting to learn too much. Actually, speaking of Jake, Jake, I have an assignment for you. I need you to find us a new cast member. Someone to replace Matt.
So how's Pat?
Rachel? I think something very weird is going on.
For this next phase, we need to be more appealing to the audience. We'll have a new cast member, and I need to be more likable, fun, charming, shagadelic. Now, while you were watching this video, two things were probably very obvious. One, I don't know anything about wine. And 2, cinematography is kind of a big deal. Clearly, I put way too much effort into it for just a YouTube video, but also I kept bringing up people like Vittorio Storaro and how important their work is to Francis's films. So maybe you want to learn more about cinematography, and in particular, lighting. Then here's what you do. You watch the class Cinematography Basics, Introduction to Lighting Techniques by Zach Mulligan on Skillshare. It's broken into all these lessons on the aspects of lighting like color, shape, and texture. But maybe you're saying, hey Patrick, I don't have a Skillshare membership. Don't worry, I've got you covered. The first 1,000 people to click the link in the description of this video will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium. And then you'll have access to this whole online learning community with thousands of classes taught by experts in their fields. And it's not just filmmaking. You can take classes on graphic design, or writing, or cooking, or music. You saw Thomas Frank in the opening scene of this video. He has his own classes on Skillshare. Look, you've got 2 weeks until the next episode drops, and you've got to do something in that time. So go click the link in that description and get a free trial of Skillshare Premium. Learn some cool new stuff, and remember, this only applies to the first 1,000 people. So hurry. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. It's real, regular, unscripted me now, not fictional video me. A few things I want to mention because I know we're just gonna get 1,000 comments about it, and we still will because people aren't gonna watch this part. So I didn't really talk much about Tetro or Twixt. I'm sorry if you really wanted to hear about those. With all of these videos, choices have to be made about what things I think are relevant to the narrative that I'm telling. Things will always get left out. I didn't think those were essential to get into, so sorry about that. The new cut of The Godfather Part 3 coming out in December. I can't wait to see it. Will I do a follow-up video about it? Probably not, but let's just wait and see. As was already mentioned in this video, we have new merch out, Charl enamel pins, striped shirt t-shirts. We've also got our other merch with other t-shirts, mugs, cool stuff like that. So if you wanna hook yourself up with some PHW merch, that's weird to say, there's a link in the description. And finally, I still have not seen You're a Big Boy Now.